If you were asked to describe the Ottawa Senators, what adjective comes to mind? Mediocre? Uninteresting? Perhaps even a little boring? Unless you're an Ottawa Senators fan, the Sens may not even be on your NHL radar, and that's a problem. From fans to pundits, the Senators have been perennially pegged as a wildcard team at best for a good part of the last decade. People tend to overlook the Senators when talking about the Atlantic Division, this despite taking last year's Stanley Cup champions to Game 7 double overtime in the conference finals. But almost laughably, the Senators are still pegged by many to miss the playoffs entirely. But could it be for good reason? Even ignoring the constant downplaying of the Sens' success as a team, the vast majority of fans seem to forget that the original Ottawa Senators were the cornerstone of the hockey world and the creation of the NHL. This, along with the Montreal franchise we all love to hate. The predecessor of the current Senators team went on to win 11 Stanley Cups and were arguably the NHL's first dynasty. This isn't to say that the Ottawa Senators are secretly the best team in the NHL and deserve to be treated as such, not by a long shot. But they are both unappreciated and underrated by most of the hockey world, and here's why. For better or worse, Ottawa is located in between two cities you may have heard of, Toronto and Montreal. Perpetually stuck in between the two legendary teams and cities, the Senators are overshadowed more often than not. And while mediocrity is the name of the game, over the past 20 years the Ottawa Senators have fared better than both of those teams in virtually every way. This may sound ridiculous, but the data does not lie. The Senators have made the playoffs 16 times in the last 20 seasons, and while this in and of itself may surprise you, when compared to Montreal's 12 and Toronto's 8, the difference begins to put itself into perspective. To be fair, just making the playoffs isn't an inherent indicator of a successful team as shown by the Detroit Red Wings. Rather, a deep run in the playoffs is what's needed to give a proper evaluation. When adding the conference finals or further filter to our data, we're left with one deep playoff run by the Canadiens, 2 by the Leafs, and 4 by the Senators, including 1 trip to the Stanley Cup Finals. Though this is a good start, it isn't enough to justifiably say that the Senators' success has been completely understated relative to the two giants. Regular season success is just as much a factor of consideration. If not, teams like the Washington Capitals would look much worse than they actually are. When adding up the Senators' regular season point totals for the last 20 seasons, we get a collective total of 1,797 points, 1,672 points for the Habs, and 1,614 for the Leafs. If we divide this up by 20 seasons, we get an average of 90 points a season for the Senators, 83 points for the Habs, and 80 points for the Leafs. Keeping in mind, this includes the shortened NHL season, which is subjugated to only 48 games being played. We need to simulate the teams playing the full 82 games based on that season's win percentage. With that, we get a new average of 91 points a season for the Senators, 82 points for the Leafs, and 85 points for the Canadiens. Looking at some of the previous data, if we want to compare the Senators with the entire NHL, the Senators end up ranking 3rd for most playoff appearances in the last 20 years at 16. Only 3 short of the number 1 title held by the Detroit Red Wings. As we can clearly see, in terms of regular season, playoff, and deep playoff success, by every account, the Senators have trumped their bigger brothers, and yet, despite this, people seem to underestimate the team at every turn. Even looking at last season, the Hockey News ranked the Senators last out of all Canadian teams to win the Cup, despite being second only to Montreal in the regular season. Even looking at this current season, with 11 games played thus far, the Ottawa Senators are the highest ranked Canadian team at number 3 in the conference. Yet the Senators are ranked 10th in the NHL Super 16 rankings, behind teams like the Toronto Maple Leafs, Chicago Blackhawks, and Pittsburgh Penguins, who are all behind the Senators in the league standings. I think it's fair to say at this point, at the very least, we've established that the Senators are better than most would like to assume, especially when compared to their Canadian counterparts. But one point I think is essential to touch on is the historical significance of the team, and while this won't be as in-depth, I think it's important to note regardless. To begin with, the Stanley Cup we all love originates from Ottawa. The Governor-General of Canada, Frederick Stanley, who lived in Ottawa at the time, had sons who were avid hockey players in the city. Later, he and his wife also became staunch hockey fans, and so he donated the cup as a challenge cup for Canada's best amateur hockey team. The rest is history. Now on to the Senators themselves. Though the current Ottawa Senators were founded in 1992, the history of its predecessor is much more interesting. The original Senators went through many monikers: Ottawa Hockey Club, Ottawa Silver 7, and lastly the Ottawa Senators. Though the foundation of the team is very interesting, as it was one of the first amateur hockey teams in Canada and the very first hockey team in Ontario, the transition to professional hockey in the NHA and later the NHL is what we're here for. At this point, it's 1910, and the Senators had already won 4 straight Stanley Cup challenges from 1903 to 1906, and 3 more from 1909 to 1911. Once the Senators, who were still legally dubbed Ottawa Hockey Club, had entered the NHA, the predecessor of the NHL, the Senators went on to win 2 more Stanley Cups in 7 years until the Senators, Maroons, Canadiens, and Quebec Bulldogs decided to, for reasons I won't get into, collapse the NHA and become the founding members of the NHL. This is when we enter the Super 6 years of the Senators from 1920 to 1927. This group is widely accepted to be the NHL's first dynasty, with 4 Stanley Cups and placing first in the league for 7 years. Their defense-first mentality led the NHL to change the rules so that defensemen had to leave their zone when the puck did. Unfortunately, this was the height of the Senators franchise, with by far the smallest market in the NHL in a city of only 110,000 people and a slowly declining team. The Senators were eventually forced to fold in 1934. And thus is the story of the Ottawa Senators. There are many things you can knock the Sens on, like their inconsistent play over the last few years, their reluctance to spend to the cap and compete, but it's saddening to see that the NHL and the majority of hockey fans do not fairly evaluate the Senators as a team, nor as a franchise. There's a certain type of respect that the franchise, among a few others, simply does not get. Comments about the Senators' attendance, which for starters at an average capacity percentage of 96.2% is middle of the road, and comments about Erik Karlsson are essentially the only things you'll hear about the team. With the small Ottawa market and a relatively quiet team, the lack of Senators coverage is quintessential. And while this may sound like a non sequitur, there's a difference between understanding why something is and hoping it will change.